Thanks everyone for being here. Here, of course, being wherever you are during this unprecedented, strange, and difficult time. So let me just begin by saying that wherever you are and whoever you're with, I hope that you're safe and healthy and well. I'm thrilled to chat with you all about some of my work thinking and writing on empathy, and in particular, how we might build empathy. I do think that these ideas are potentially even more crucial now during this difficult time that we're all going through together than usual. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications of COVID-19 for empathy towards the end of the talk. Okay, so I want to start by going all the way back to the beginning, like maybe 50 or 100,000 years ago, to a time when people really weren't that impressive. At that moment, we were just medium-sized mammals, not particularly fast or strong. We couldn't fly. We weren't even the only smart species on the planet. At that time, we shared the Earth with at least 5 other large-brained human species. And yet there were some things that set us apart. Most of all, each other. Far more than any other animal on the planet, sapiens collaborated and cared for one another. And that made all the difference. Because even if as individuals we were unassuming, as a collective, we were breathtaking. We could do things no other animal could ever dream of. It was by working together that we took over the world. But what allows us to work so well together? Well, there's a few reasons for this, maybe many, but one that psychologists and neuroscientists have been fascinated with for the better part of a century is the weird and wonderful fact that even though people are physically separate from each other, psychologically, we overlap. And that sense of self-other overlap can be so intense that sometimes when we see something occur to somebody else, it actually feels like it's happening to us instead. In case you haven't had this experience recently and you're not scared of heights, here's a guy walking across the Grand Canyon. Now, the funny thing is that although I can't see all of you, I assume that you are sitting or standing on relatively solid ground. So am I. The Bay Area is the relatively is operative. But if you're anything like me, just looking at this video, you might feel your palms start to sweat. You might feel a little bit nervous, like it were you, not him, on the wire. That experience is a primitive form of empathy, our emotional and psychological entanglements with each other. Empathy is a simple word for a complex idea. And in fact, researchers like me think of empathy actually as an umbrella term that describes multiple ways that we connect with each other's emotions. So I'll try to explain this using an example. Let's say that you're having lunch with a friend and he gets a phone call. You don't know who's on the other side of the line or what they're saying, but you can tell it's not good because your friend begins to cry. Well, as you see him break down, a few things might happen in you. First, you might feel bad yourself, vicariously sharing his feelings, which we would call emotional empathy. You might also try to understand what he's feeling and why, which we would call cognitive empathy. And third, at least if you're a decent pal, you probably care about your friend and wish for him to feel better. And you might even try to figure out how you could help. That's what we often call empathic concern or compassion. And you might think that these 3 pieces are just different sides of the same coin, but it turns out they split apart in really interesting ways. So for instance, they're only moderately correlated across the population. What does that mean? It means that if you're, for instance, really tend to intensely share other people's emotions, that actually doesn't tell me very much about whether you'll be good at understanding their emotions as well. These pieces of empathy are also affected in different conditions. People with autism spectrum disorders sometimes struggle to understand what others are feeling, but they're perfectly able to share and care about other people's emotions. Whereas people with psychopathy often have the opposite profile. So these pieces of empathy are related, but can be separated. And nonetheless, together, they make up the full range of human empathy. You can think about empathy as an individual quality, how much of it you or someone you know has. We can also think about empathy like in your town or our country or the Stanford diaspora as the psychological or human equivalent of a natural resource. And it is a precious one. Decades of evidence now demonstrate countless ways that empathy benefits like everyone involved, including ourselves. We often think of empathy as something we do for others, but when individuals feel empathy, they benefit as well. For instance, they report being happier, they report less depression and stress, they have an easier time forming and keeping important relationships, and they're more likely to succeed professionally. Empathy's benefits, of course, bubble outward. Patients of empathic doctors more satisfied with their care. Employees of empathic managers are less likely to call in sick with stress-related illnesses. And maybe unsurprisingly, spouses of empathic partners tend to report being happier in their marriages. But maybe the most important and most crucial role of empathy is actually in helping us stitch together broader communities, not just between us and the people we know and love, but even towards strangers. So for instance, people who tend to feel lots of empathy also tend to help strangers, for instance, by volunteering and donating to charity. And empathy also makes it less likely that we see strangers who are different from us through the lens of stereotyping, prejudice, and bias. So this is great. We've got on our side empathy, this ancient instinctive engine for kindness and collaboration and cooperation. And we, the most empathic animal on the planet, took the place over. So we must be just living in an empathic utopia, all sitting in a global circle together, holding hands and sing. Well, no, that's not, of course, the world that we live in. Empathy is hard. And I would argue that it's getting harder. To understand why, we can revisit our Paleolithic pals here and think about the social world in which empathy evolved, and maybe the world that it's built for. Well, at that time, human beings existed in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers. What that means is that if you ran into somebody else, probably a few things were true. You were likely familiar to each other, maybe even related. You were visible to each other. We could hear pain and pleasure in each other's voice, see it on each other's faces. And we were accountable. In small communities, people can tally other people's history of kindness or indifference, and karma is like real and concrete. I think of these ingredients of social life, familiarity, visibility, and accountability, as empathy's primordial soup, sort of a cocktail that together make it easy and natural for us to connect with and care about one another. But I would also argue that these ingredients of social life have rapidly disappeared, especially in the last century or so. Humanity has, with incredible speed, moved into large cities and started living alone, meaning that in a real way, we see more people than ever, but we know fewer of them. Rituals that used to bring us into regular contact, everything from bowling leagues to church going, have given way to solitary pursuits often carried out online. Online in settings where we often are anonymous to each other. We don't have the cues that spark our empathy, and we don't have accountability towards others. And online in settings where often the first thing that we learn about someone is something that we fear or despise, where people become enemies before they have a chance to be people. This type of environment is not necessarily great soil for social connection. And along with these huge structural changes, we've seen incredible increases in loneliness, cynicism, anxiety, and decreases in empathy. One could in fact argue that if you want to build a system to break human empathy, you could scarcely do better than we have. And I'm going to show you some evidence that it has broken. So here's the most common way that psychologists measure empathy. It's just a self-report scale. It's a series of statements, and you're told to say how well each statement describes you, from 1, not at all, to 5, extremely. So I'll give you a couple of them, and you can think about them on your own. So here's one. I often have tender concern feelings for people less fortunate than me. You can think about how well that describes you. Here's another. I try and look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I make a decision, right? Again, you can think about how well that describes you. So your answer to those statements plus 26 others would give you an empathy index or score somewhere between 1 and 5. Hopefully that makes sense. This test was developed in the 1970s, and since then, hundreds of thousands of people have taken it. And recently, psychologists decided to aggregate this information, and the news was not great. Here I'll show you the average American's score on this test in 1979. 4 out of 5, not terrible, a solid B. Here it is again in 2009, much closer to a 3 out of 5. It's a big drop. To put it in perspective, the average American in 2009, by their own self-report, was less empathic than 75% of Americans just 30 years before. So maybe this study is shocking to you. Or maybe it's the opposite of shocking. Maybe you didn't need a study to tell you that it's become harder for people to connect with each other. I know it's been a very interesting experience for me, right? My entire scientific career, I've spent documenting, in many cases, the really powerful benefits that empathy gives to us and the people around us. But as a person, I've noticed all of these trends, from political polarization to certain aspects of life online that seem to be pulling us apart instead of bringing us together. It's almost like the culture that we've built is poorly calibrated with the instincts for togetherness and connection that allowed us to build it in the first place. I felt sometimes like being a psychologist studying empathy these days feels like being a climate scientist studying the polar ice. We document the benefits of something just as it disappears all around us, which is bleak, I know, and we're only 15 minutes in. But that's good, actually, because I'm hoping that we can use the rest of our time to think hard about this problem and what we can do about it. And in particular, I want to spend the rest of our time on a simple question. Does it have to be this way? Do we have to accept that as we continue to become more urban, more technologically mediated, which we will, that we are also doomed to become more callous, less connected, even crueler? Or can we push back? Is there anything that we can do to try to reclaim our common humanity and rebuild our empathy? I'll be sharing some thoughts for the rest of the talk, but please feel free to share your own in the chat as well if you like. So from my perspective, the answer to this question, can we rebuild our empathy, boils down to the answer to an even simpler question. Is empathy something that we can control at all? And I would say that standard wisdom from my own fields of psychology and neuroscience has been, not really. We can't control our empathy because it's a trait. Maybe this is an intuition that you've had in the past. I don't know, try it out. Think about the most empathic person you've ever met or known, and the least empathic person you've ever known. Now, maybe you think that those two people were just born that way, that their level of empathy or lack thereof was just kind of hardwired into their genes and coded into their brains. If you believe that, well, then maybe you also believe that, let's say that there's a line between the most and least empathic person, that each of us might have some level of empathy. And just like our adult height or the color of our eyes, we're mostly stuck there for life, right? We can't change. That's just sort of where we are. Now, if you are high in empathy, this is great news for you. It means you are bound to benefit from empathy's positive qualities, and the people around you are as well. But if you struggle to connect with people, this is terrible news, because it means that no matter what you do or how hard you try, you can't get better at it. It's even worse news for us as a group, because it means that if the modern world is putting barriers up that make empathy harder, there's nothing we can do to overcome those barriers either. This is a fatalistic view of empathy. Thankfully, it's also wrong. I want to spend the rest of our time together today telling you about a new view of human empathy in science that I and many other people have been working on. But I want to start by telling you that for me, it's actually not that new at all. In fact, this is a view that defined a lot of my childhood. It turns out that in the early 1970s, Washington State University in Pullman offered graduate scholarships to students from some of the world's poorest nations. And my mom got the scholarship from Peru. And my dad did not get a scholarship, not as good a student as my mom, but came to Washington State anyways from Pakistan. So they traveled from these two massive cities of Lima and Lahore, again, to this tiny little town of Pullman, where they fell in love. It turns out that for them, it was not meant to be. When I think about my parents, even now, I think that one of the big things that they had in common was their sense of foreignness in the US. I think they were both pretty uncomfortable here when they got here, and that they found comfort in each other. But as they acclimated to their new country, I mean, now they've been here for 50 years almost, I think they realized how little they had in common, which as their only child is extremely little. I mean, these people are just very different from each other. So I spent a lot of my childhood sort of watching them get divorced, right? They started when I was 8 and didn't finish until I was 12, and it was not one of the amicable kinds. And so I spent a lot of time sort of shuttling back and forth between their houses during that process. And to me, it often felt like I was going between parallel universes. I'm sure anyone here who's a child of divorce maybe can sympathize with this, but I felt like when I was with my mom, I had to basically tune myself to her emotional frequencies, figure out what mattered to her and make that matter to me as well. But when I got to my dad's house, those same rules stopped applying and I had to recalibrate, which is hard emotional labor for like an 8-year-old, right? And I think that for a while, the three of us thought that I would basically have to pick one parent and kind of give up on the other. But I knew that for all of our sake, I had to keep trying. And so I did. And eventually it got easier. I learned to tune myself more easily to their different emotional frequencies and eventually managed to keep my connection to each of my parents really strong, even as their connection to each other disintegrated. I would say that empathy basically saved my family and my childhood, but not because it came naturally. I think of my parents' divorce as an empathy gym that forced me to work at care and understanding, really almost as a survival skill. And, you know, I think that that experience and the benefits that it brought to me is a big reason why I study what I do in the first place. In the many years since then, I've documented lots of evidence that runs counter to standard wisdom, but actually jibes with my own childhood experience. It turns out that empathy is not just a trait. Yes, our genes do matter, but so do our experiences. And empathy can usefully be viewed really as something like a skill, because some experiences can cause it to atrophy, but other experiences can cause our empathy to grow and broaden and intensify. And critically, that means that the choices and habits and practices that we make and cultivate can allow us to build our empathy on purpose, the same way you'd work out a muscle. So if my parents' divorce was an empathy gym for me, I now see my job as building empathy gyms for other people. My colleagues and I try to set up situations where people can practice caring and understanding and get better at it if they want to. I want to share with you just a few of the insights that we've gotten along the way. The first one is that if you want to cross boundaries between us and them, you can begin by returning to you and I. One of the most painful and difficult things about division in our culture, as I see it, is that it stops us from being curious about who's on the other side. Whether it's a generational divide, an ideological one, a racial or ethnic one, we often start to reduce people to just one part of their identity and stop wondering really who they are. The good news is that that type of prejudice or dehumanization is really hard to do up close because people are complicated and no one can be reduced to just one part of their identity. So it turns out that when we get to know individuals who are different from us and really think about their experiences as individual people, we don't just build empathy for them, we actually build empathy for the whole group to which they belong. Recently, my colleagues at Stanford's virtual reality lab and I tried a high-tech version of this type of empathy building. We used a VR simulation to help people build empathy for individuals from a group that often doesn't receive a lot of empathy, homeless people in the Bay Area. So we created a simulation that had a number of different scenes in it that mimicked what it might be like to become homeless. So here in the first one, someone has been evicted from their apartment and is trying to sell their furniture to make ends meet. They're then living in their car, which is impounded. And finally, they've taken to a local bus line for shelter in the last scene. And I should say that this was based on interviews with homeless individuals in the Bay Area. This was a short simulation, just about 15 minutes, but we found that it had long-lasting impact. So people who went through this VR simulation as compared to folks in a control group actually reported even 1 month later less tendency to dehumanize homeless individuals and more support for affordable housing policies in the Bay Area, which, as many of you know, is a crucial issue these days especially. So again, the punchline here is that when we focus on particular individuals, you and I, instead of reducing people to us and them mentality, we can often build our empathy. We did that using VR, but the good news is you don't need like an Oculus Rift to understand the experiences of people who are different from you. It turns out that reading novels whose protagonists come from different groups builds our empathy for real people from those groups. But the best way to get to know an individual who's different from you is to get to know an individual who's different from us. I feel like, they're all around, but sometimes it can feel challenging, especially these days in this hyper-polarized age, to try and really make a meaningful connection to someone we disagree with or someone we don't identify with. But it turns out that when we take the effort to do that, we often broaden our social antenna in ways that can be really powerful. So that was principle number one. The second principle that I want to share with you is that caring is contagious. In a good type of contagion for a change. All sorts of behaviors are contagious because human beings are a herd species. We tend to do and think and feel and say what people around us do. And that can be tragic when negative behaviors spread through our social networks. But it can also be positive. In my own research, I found that when people believe that others around them are empathic and generous, they themselves are more likely to act in caring ways as well. Recently, my colleagues and I decided to see if we could leverage the power of conformity to build kinder cultures among the most conformist people on the planet. Not a knock on them, but it's true. 7th graders. They really are, by age, the most conformist group of people we have. And so we worked in 4 Bay Area middle schools with about 850 students in 7th grade. And about 200 of these, we put in a condition that we call an empathic norms condition, which simply means that we tried to convince these students that empathy was popular among their peers. I'm going to try to play you a short video, a clip from a video that we showed them, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
Specifically, 7th graders tend to like empathy more, meaning that they want to be empathic. They also value empathy in others, meaning that they like it when other people are empathic and want to be friends with empathic people. Finally, they expect empathy from others, meaning that in 7th grade, most people are empathic. And now more than ever, you and your 7th grade peers are better able to share and understand each other's emotions.
Okay, so this again was meant to convince students in that condition that empathy was popular among their peers. After that, we had students describe why they valued empathy, and then we collated all their responses. Why? Well, so that when they came back, we could show them basically a brochure of all of their friends and classmates saying why they valued empathy. In essence, we were trying to alert students to a real social norm all around them, how popular empathy was among their peers. We then asked them to tell us how people in their grade felt about empathy, and they took to this task really well. So here's one sample response. People in my grade feel very strongly about empathy. In 7th grade, it's really important to value empathy, and I can see that many people in my grade value it a lot. Smiley face emoji, which I take to be one of the most enthusiastic things a 7th grader can give, at least to me. So students in this condition, after learning how popular empathy was, at least telling us that they value it. Did they also act in empathic ways? Well, to test that, we returned to these schools 1 to 2 months later, and we asked students to nominate people in their class who were nice, who did favors or helped other kids, and who seemed caring. And what we found is that students in our empathic norm condition compared to students in control conditions told us that they were more motivated to empathize. And that in turn predicted that a month later, their classmates reported them as acting in kind ways. Mind you, not that they told us that they acted kindly, that other people told us that they acted kindly, which we take to be even a more convincing measure. So to me, this is a really hopeful study. I also think it's one that has implications that go far beyond school settings. I think in our culture, sometimes the loudest voices are not the kindest. So think about these students. Before our study, they might have been paying attention to a schoolyard bully. Or you can think about extreme pundits on cable news, or your favorite loud, mean person on Twitter. These people might not represent us, but it's easy, they take up so much airtime that it's easy to think that they do, and to feel like if we want to fit in, we have to fall in line and act the way that they do. Since my book published last year, I've received hundreds of emails from people who want a kinder and more empathic culture. I think of them almost as a quiet majority under the surface of often a very loud, mean surface, right? And so I always encourage them to make their empathy loud and to make it visible. I think this is especially important for leaders in really any space, whether you're the leader of a school, a family, a town, or a company. I work with lots of organizations, leaders in companies and school systems, hospital systems, you name it, who want to inject more empathy into their workplace cultures. And the first thing that I tell them is that it has to come from the top, right? Because the behaviors that people in leadership model and make visible and highlight and celebrate and elevate don't just become visible to people on the ground, they become more contagious. So the third and final kind of principle that I want to leave you with is that simply understanding that we can build empathy is the first step towards doing so. I'm sure some of you are familiar with my incredible colleague, Carol Dweck, and her work on mindsets. Really briefly, this is the idea that our beliefs about ourselves can become self-fulfilling. Prophecies, right? If you believe that something like your intelligence is a fixed trait, you might not be motivated to work on it. But if you believe that you can grow, then you might be more motivated to put in effort. Well, as soon as I got to Stanford, Carol and I decided to see whether the same was true of empathy. In one study, or set of studies rather, we presented people with one of two essays meant to impart different beliefs about how empathy works. The first, empathy like plaster is pretty stable over time, was meant to induce people to feel like empathy was a fixed trait, that no matter what they did, they couldn't build it. The second essay, empathy is changeable and can be developed, was meant to convince people that empathy was a skill. After they read one of these two essays, we put participants through an empathy obstacle course full of situations where it might not come naturally to connect with somebody else. We found over and over again that people we had just convinced that empathy was a skill worked harder at it. For instance, they spent more time listening to stories told by someone of a different race. And they told us they would invest more energy trying to understand the opinions of someone they disagreed with politically. Again, to us, this is an optimistic finding because it suggests that people can build their empathy. I also think it's a somewhat ironic finding. As I've just been telling you, sort of the classic wisdom from my field and beyond is that empathy is a fixed trait. Well, it turns out that maybe that's not just wrong, but that belief could be toxic and counterproductive. Because if you think of empathy as a fixed trait, you might be discouraged from working on it, even if that work could benefit you and the people around you. By contrast, if you understand that empathy is a skill, well, then you might see that you have the opportunity, and I would say maybe the responsibility, to work on it in ways that adhere to your values and the person you would like to become. Hopefully by now you understand that empathy is a skill and can start to think about how you want to point it in your own life. I would argue that maybe that's never been more important than now, or at least not in a long time, as the world reels, of course, from this global pandemic and the long-lasting, unpredictable effects that it will have on all of us. I want to close today by thinking a little bit about disasters and what they reveal about us, humanity. It turns out that catastrophes are a collision point for two stories about human nature. The two stories start in the same way. They start by saying that disasters rip away our comfortable routines and take away also social norms and conventions, and they reveal the true human nature underneath. But the two stories then go in totally opposite directions. One story you might have seen in movies about disasters, where what is revealed is not very good. In those movies, after and during disasters, people fall apart and tear each other apart. They panic, they act selfishly, and social order collapses. Well, a different story emerges from the historical record. A book that I think is so timely these days and just wonderful in general is Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell. Solnit goes through a number of different disasters: the earthquakes in San Francisco in 1906 and 1989, the bombing of London during World War II, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, and over again, she finds that that story about human nature seems to be contradicted. In fact, it turns out when the lights go out and the rules go away, people turn up for each other. People help strangers and neighbors, and they form pop-up communities of mutual aid. Because along with our routines, what else is ripped away? Some of the separateness that usually governs our lives. Disasters often put us in the same boat, and sometimes quite literally. So Solnit, for instance, talks about the Cajun Navy, a group of private boat captains, some of them just having these little tiny rafts, who went back through the wreckage over and over again, trying to find anybody who they could save, and often risking their own lives in the process. Of course, COVID-19 is one of the great disasters of our time. And I think that a lot of us have been focused on the first story that it reveals. The people who have acted in selfish ways. We see headlines about folks who are hoarding toilet paper or flouting social distancing measures. And that is true, that's really happening, and it's really can be destructive. But I think we should definitely ensure that we're also paying attention to the widespread acts of kindness that this pandemic has brought. So all around the world, people have found ways to help each other, just as Solnit writes about. A lot of this happens on Google spreadsheets. Google spreadsheets may be not the most inspiring genre most of the time, but all around the world, people have created spreadsheets to help their neighbors who might be more vulnerable to the pandemic. People have turned out for each other in ways that I've almost never experienced in my lifetime. And so yes, although this disaster has harmed us in so many ways, I think it's also revealed some of our best sides, as our worst moments sometimes do. Now, there's of course a massive difference between COVID and disasters like Katrina or 9/11, which is that those other disasters happen quickly. Now, they might affect us for a long time, but they happen quickly. COVID is a slow disaster that will continue to affect us and the people we care about and people who we don't know for years or even decades to come. And I think that a big and vital question of our age will be whether we can take the acts of kindness that we've seen and hopefully that we've taken part in during the catastrophe and turn those into habits of kindness instead. So I'll just close by saying that if you are looking for ways to practice kindness, to take some of the topics that I've discussed in this talk and make them practical for yourself, it just so happens that this week I'm holding a sort of digital event called the Global Kindness Challenge. It's actually based on a seminar that I teach at Stanford called Becoming Kinder, that has a series of little empathy building exercises that I assign to students. Well, this week I feel like, because this is such a lonely and painful summer for so many people, I want to share those same exercises with people around the world. So if you're interested in taking part or spreading the word, please feel free to join us. It's been really inspiring seeing people's stories thus far. Great, and with that, I'll just thank all of you for your time and attention, and I really look forward to your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamil. How has the data on empathy changed in other countries outside of the United States? And is there a comparative change?
It's a great question and one that we don't have an answer for. So there's cross-sectional data that there's data from all around the world at this point using that same empathy scale that I described. So for instance, I can tell you that as of 2017, the US ranked, I think, 8th or 9th in empathy among 63 nations that were sampled, which is not bad, I think was impressive. And we also have longitudinal data over the decades from within the US. But unfortunately, we don't have the combination of those two things. So we don't have long-term data from around the world that we would need to answer that very good question in a satisfactory way. Now, I think people are asking these questions a lot more and using that scale a lot more around the world. So as the years go by, we'll be able to chart change around the world, not just within the US.
And where can people find the empathy index if they're looking for more information about that? And do you have information about the breakdown of that index in terms of demographics or other ways to kind of cut and look at that?
There's all sorts of information about this. So the scale is called the Interpersonal Reactivity Index. It was developed by a psychologist named Mark Davis, who is at Eckerd College, Eckerd, I believe in Florida. And his site has the IRI on it, so you can download it and try it out anytime you want. There's all sorts of information about demographic breakdowns on the IRI. So, generational and age differences, gender differences are the two that I'm most aware of. But, like I said, hundreds of thousands of people have taken this test by now. So there's lots of information about it.
And Amelia just asked, have there been reevaluations at all of the questions that are in there now that the survey is more than 40 years old?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when the study came out sort of pointing to this empathy decline, I interviewed Mark and I kind of asked him, do you think any of these questions are outdated? And he said, well, take the test, see what you think. And, I have to admit, the questions are they feel pretty universal to me. There have been some attempts to add scales to them to test the validity in new contexts, and it's a pretty robust scale. So what do I mean by robust? Well, the way that you'd want to test something like this is you want to say, well, wait a minute, someone's telling me they're empathic. How do I know to believe them? Maybe that's just someone who's really full of themselves, right? Telling me that they're maxing out on all sorts of positive qualities. But it turns out that you can also measure empathy physiologically. So like I could give someone an electric shock and see how the person next to them, whether that person's palms start to sweat as a physiological sign of their sharing of the person's emotions. I can, and in fact do, scan people's brains while they observe others experiencing emotions, and I see how much their brain states match. You can also look at people's propensity to act in generous ways. And people's score on the IRI actually tracks all of those other metrics, right? So that's why we believe that it's a relatively valid scale, because it's not just people telling us something, it's people telling us something that also corresponds to their behavior.
I'm going to connect a few questions because we've had over 60 that have been asked. Are there certain requisites for empathy? And for example, what extent do trust, vulnerability, self-awareness, emotional intelligence have to be present to flourish? And how would you persuade an analytical person or someone who doesn't think empathy is a value worth growing? How would you convince them that it is?
Yeah, I do this all the time. I mean, yeah, like I said, I actually work with lots and lots of organizations of all types. And let me tell you that different people in different sectors have different viewpoints about empathy and its value. I've heard people give me all sorts of stereotypes about empathy, especially in workplace settings. Sometimes in Silicon Valley, I've heard empathy is a feminine quality, or empathy will interfere with our bottom line, or my ability to give people feedback that's honest. It's so easy to debunk those beliefs because, in essence, the opposite is true in every case. I mean, empathy turns out to be a massive competitive advantage in workplace culture, especially in retaining and finding and recruiting talent. It tracks all sorts of other positive qualities within relationships, within professional and personal relationships. It tracks positive health indices. it's really easy to make the case to someone that they should be empathic for themselves. And that's fine. I mean, I also hope that that's not the only convincing argument for empathy, right? Because empathy produces not only psychological safety and sort of opens the door for vulnerability in the person who's expressing it, it also obviously, produces a more positive climate for the people around us. And so, I hope that people are motivated both to do things that are healthy for themselves and for others.
And you brought up myths. Is there such a thing as too much empathy? Can you relate and share other people's feelings so much that it starts to negatively impact you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I tell people that empathy is a skill and they can build it, sometimes I get a question, so should I just turn my empathy up to 11 all the time, like in This Is Spinal Tap, right? And just leave it. It's like, no, absolutely not. That'd be a disaster. I mean, I used to live in New York City, and just to think about walking down one Manhattan block while taking on everybody else's pain, I mean, you would just collapse, right? And that's not always the way to help other people either, right? I don't want my therapist sort of like crying when I'm in a session with them and saying, gosh, your life really is terrible. Right? Like, he doesn't need to share my struggles, but he does need to care about them. And this is where I think some of the differential or distinctions between types of empathy matter so much. I have a whole chapter in my book around medical empathy. It turns out that one of my children spent a lot of time early in her life at a NICU. And the physicians and nurses and social workers there were these empathic superheroes to us. The care that they gave us was astounding and so meaningful. And I started to worry about them. I was like, how can they possibly keep this up? And so I went and shadowed them for my book, and I found really what a struggle it is to sort of be in those kind of fire hose of human suffering types of spaces and keep connected. And so I researched a lot about empathy and burnout. And what I found was that really, so you might remember, Mei-Ling, that I was talking about sharing other people's emotions, like vicariously catching their feelings, and then compassion, or sort of caring for other people without feeling as they do. It turns out that sharing other people's emotions is a risk factor for burnout, fatigue, and even sort of symptoms of trauma. By contrast, feeling for other people, empathic concern, is a protective factor against burnout. So it turns out that the way that one empathizes matters a lot more sometimes than how much they're empathizing, right? I mean, it's not just a volume knob that we're turning up. If I can torture the metaphor even further, I'm old enough to remember stereo equalizers. You remember where you could like turn up or down different frequency ranges. I think one of the pieces of the art of caring in a sustainable way is tuning ourselves to types of empathy that are more useful. I realize this is a long answer. The last thing I'll say is that some of that tuning can be done through certain meditation practices.
And you answered another question someone had, which is, what is the difference between empathy and compassion? Can you also differentiate empathy from sympathy?
Yeah, sympathy is a tough one scientifically because its definition has really flip-flopped a lot over the years. So it became really popular among like the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers like Adam Smith and Hume, and they would talk about sympathy the exact same way that people now would talk about emotional empathy, as this like really visceral sharing of other people's emotional states. Then the term empathy took over in like 1909 in English, and people stopped using sympathy the way that they had, and now they use it to mean something more distant, almost like pity. I just shy away from it altogether because I feel like its definitional wobble is too much for me. And trust me, as someone who studies empathy, I deal with a lot of definitional wobble, but to go, the way I just see sympathy used in totally incompatible ways. So I like to stick with empathy, which is what psychologists and researchers have really focused on much more.
So I'm glad that you just talked a lot about this time that we're in and what happens in crisis. And so I think many people have voted this question as a result. So is the solution to increasing empathy solely just about individual behavior, or are there kind of collective actions that we could take to make society more empathic? And there were a couple of other questions also around that in terms of, if you're the leader of an organization, how can you promote it? And are there grassroots examples that we've seen outside of corporate America?
Oh gosh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so one of the myths that I think is we're always worth debunking is that empathy is an individual sport, right? That we're all only responsible for the empathy, for our own empathy, right? I mean, in fact, we influence each other massively and constantly, and especially people in power. I think whether they're in power in government or organizations, companies, et cetera, have the opportunity, and I would say the responsibility, to really be stewards of their culture. And again, one way to do that is to really make empathy, is to reward empathy, to make it sort of, to incentivize it, to make it part of the make it part of the structure of our culture, right? Whether that's our culture at work or at home or at school or wherever, right? To really value it in visible and concrete ways. And that's on leadership. Then what can the rest of us do in terms of collective actions? Well, I use this phrase a lot, make empathy loud. And people are like, well, I don't want to, I'm too embarrassed. And is it unempathic to brag about how empathic I'm being? And my whole thing is, you don't have to make your own empathy loud. Make other people's empathy loud, right? I mean, I think there's so much coverage, so much attention paid to cruelty in our culture. And for good reason. We need to be aware of the pain that people cause each other so that we can do something about it. The fight for justice in the US and beyond in the last months has been one powerful example of that. But I also think it's so important to elevate and show people not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. To bring to light examples that you see in your life or that you see in your culture of people acting kindly and empathically. Right? I think that those positive examples can influence people just as much as negative examples, and influence them in a way that also includes some hope.
In terms of teaching empathy, there are a few questions like, how can parents and grandparents teach empathy to kids? And when can that begin? Is that something early or later in life?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of programs to try to do this now. The University of Wisconsin has a terrific kindness curriculum that has been rolled out in hundreds of schools. Socio-emotional learning is, of course, an explosive field within education. So there's lots of practices that start with helping kids recognize and be precise about understanding their own emotions. So, emotional intelligence work, the Ruler program out of Yale is one such example, using contemplative techniques like meditation to be mindful and understand our own feelings. I think that's often the beginning of understanding other people's feelings for kids. Yeah, I mean, as the parent of a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, we try this all the time. We try to create a map of emotions and ask our kids what types of emotions they felt today, and ask them to identify emotions that characters in books feel, characters in movies that their friends have felt. I'll try to not go on for too long here. We also, to the point of making empathy visible, we have a jar at our dinner table, and every day after dinner, we write about something kind that somebody did. And we it's a little bit of a gratitude exercise, but it's pointed at kindness and empathy in particular. And then we put it in the jar and we read it at the end of the year. So, there's just these little things that we can do. Again, I think that such an important feature here, not just in teaching kids, but for all of us, is just to think about how to go beyond isolated actions towards habits. Can you build time in your day or time in your week? Can you add something as annoying as a Google Calendar reminder to help you stay on track? It's really easy to lose track, especially in this overwhelming, stressful time that we're living in. But it's so useful, and surprisingly useful, to try to make kindness and empathy habits when we can.
Going back to the survey that we started with, has any research been done on people who took the survey in the 70s and 80s and what the diversity of their communities looked like? This person's curious about whether self-reporting empathy in a survey changes when your community starts to become more diverse, and then maybe you have an increased realization that you might be racist or sexist, and honesty changes with self-reporting. So what is there a margin of error there for people that over-report?
It's a huge and very important question. I'll try to be brief here. So being surrounded with other people who are different than oneself, used to be thought of as the magic bullet for increasing empathy. This is what was known as contact theory. I think it was it Mark Twain who said that travel is sort of that. No, what is it? That prejudice and prejudice can't survive travel, or something like that, which is why so many people need it. Basically, that in essence, when we experience prejudice, we don't know people well enough, and if we did know people better, our prejudice would melt away and our empathy would grow. That's true sometimes. It's not true all of the time. In fact, sometimes when people enter a more diverse setting, if they feel, for instance, that a new group of people is encroaching on their opportunities or their neighborhoods, for instance, they can become more prejudiced and more exclusionary. It seems as though the fulcrum on which useful or non-useful contact occurs is whether that contact is personal and meaningful. So simply being surrounded by people who don't look like you might not be a great tool for empathy, but getting to know them might be a better tool for empathy. And there's evidence that, in essence, when people form meaningful relationships with others, I don't know whether their IRI scores change, because I don't know whether their general empathy changes, but certainly their empathy towards towards people who are unlike them along those dimensions can increase.
Another person asked if you're familiar with David Brooks' Nation of the Weavers project. I wonder if you might speak to any overlaps between your work on empathy and his work on social cohesion, or relatedly, if you could talk about empathy as it relates to Putnam's Bowling Alone.
Yeah, I'm a friend of the Weavers. I think that their work is terrific. And, you know, in fact, the kindness challenge that's out on the internet today is called Disagreeing Better, sort of an attempt to find someone who we disagree with, and instead of sniping at each other about our opinions, interviewing them about the way that they came to have those opinions. The idea being that we can, even if we continue to disagree, we can sort of find the humanity and even some common experiences underneath our disagreements, which is basically, I think, quite aligned with the Weaver mission. Bowling Alone was a big inspiration for me. I do think that, you know, there's an epidemic of loneliness that all sorts of people are writing about right now, including the former Surgeon General just had a book come out about the epidemic of loneliness. And isolation and loneliness, ironically, can turn us inward. They can make us feel like we only have energy for ourselves and make us lose out on opportunities to connect with other people. So yeah, I think that they're sadly intertwined and can create a vicious cycle.
This might be a fast one, but a few people missed the citation for your study about the drop in empathy that we've experienced.
Oh, sure. It's Sarah Conrath, Konrath, and her colleagues. It was published in 2011. I'm happy to share with you, and if people want to follow up, where they can follow up with me, and I'll send it to them.
Great. And then I think this will be our last question, just looking at time. So in the book, Living Danishly, there's a statement that one of the elements of happiness that people in Denmark has comes from the trust in government and public institutions. They know when they become sick, the healthcare system will take care of them. If they lose their job, the government can help with funds or skills. What's your view on that experience and culture and how that influences how empathic we are, and how that the best examples come from our leaders?
Yeah, so I mean, there aren't great data on sort of social safety nets and their relationship to empathy. And I don't want to editorial, obviously I have many opinions, but I don't think that people are here to necessarily just listen to my opinions. I mean, one thing that I'll say is that stress and anxiety can decrease our empathy, right? They can, again, like loneliness, turn us inward. And I think that in essence, when we are struggling and when we feel as though we are alone and have been abandoned by people around us, that doesn't seem to me like a good soil in which empathy can grow, right? If we feel so atomized that there's no connection to a broader culture, whether that's from a social safety net or from not encountering people in meaningful ways as much, or just from, you know, being on internet comment sections for too long. I mean, I think that there are lots of experiences that can foster a sense of alienation that I think, you know, is part of the erosion of empathy we've seen in modern times. And one that I think is reversible. You know, I really want to hammer that point home. I think that we're we've been headed in a difficult direction when it comes to empathy for a long time. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that we could push back.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and for being with us here today.
It's been my total pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks everyone for being here and for your great questions. I'm wishing everyone well during these difficult times.